Welcome, Age of Vintage Society. Spencer Tracy was one of the finest actors in the history of Hollywood. He did not have the matinee idol looks of a conventional leading man, and he did not need them. His talent for acting and the seemingly effortless ease and consistency of his performances were what made him stand out. Why was Spencer Tracy respected even by Clark Gable? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. In the early 1930s, Spencer Tracy's truculent attitude and thunderingly aberrant behaviour were his only defences against studio power brokers, who cast him as stereotypical conmen, buddies and gangsters. But by the end of the decade, the actor's on-screen style, seamless naturalism and subtle inflections had proved the ticket to stardom. A Tracy performance was always more than just action. There was always an undercurrent of mental activity beneath the surface. Stanley Kramer, who directed him in several films, recalled, "I was afraid to say, 'Spencer, you're a great actor.' He'd only say, 'Now what the hell kind of thing is that to come out with?' He wanted to know it, he needed to know it, but he didn't want you to say it, just think it. And maybe that was one of the reasons he was a great actor. He thought and listened better than anyone in the history of motion pictures." A silent close-up reaction of Spencer Tracy said it all. His seemingly effortless approach earned him the respect of his peers, helping him to become one of the most distinguished and venerated actors of his generation. He's the kind of actor who makes it look so easy, and you think to yourself, I can do that. Go ahead and try it. It's not easy, and you can't do it. Spencer Tracy is widely considered to be the greatest film actor of the 20th century, perhaps even the greatest actor of all time. Several contemporaries considered Tracy the greatest actor of his era, a sentiment summed up by actor Richard Widmark, who once said, "He's the greatest movie actor there ever was. I've learned more about acting from watching Tracy than in any other way." Clark Gable considered him untouchable. "The guy's good," Gable famously said. "There's nobody in the business who can touch him, and you're a fool to try. And the bastard knows it, so don't fall for that humble stuff." Of all the screen legends whose names remain synonymous with Hollywood, few took as long to become a star as Spencer Tracy, who is today recognised as one of the greatest actors ever, but whose career did not truly take off until he was already in his mid-30s, after languishing with Fox for 5 years and over 24 movies. Tracy was scarcely a blip on the box office barometer in 1935, a critic's darling and little more. Tracy's early childhood was one of intense rebelliousness. He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a blue-collar Midwestern town famous for beer and bratwurst. By all accounts, he was a little tearaway, a tough, pig-headed, freckle-faced urchin who was always getting himself into trouble. He was a poor student too, and even the nuns and Jesuits at his schools failed to knock much sense into him. He was a difficult and overactive child with sporadic school attendance. His mother came from a wealthy Presbyterian family, while his father was Irish Catholic and worked as a truck salesman. Tracy also had a brother named Carol, who was 4 years older than him. He was raised Catholic and educated by Dominican nuns. He conceded to learning because he wanted to be able to read movie subtitles, and movies fascinated him immensely. He would view certain films frequently so that he could reenact some of the scenes with his friends. He was expelled from a total of 15 grade schools. He enlisted in the Navy when he was turned 18 and was stationed at Naval Station Great Lakes in North Chicago. He was still a student when World War I ended and was discharged when he achieved the rank of Seaman Second Class. By the time he reached high school, he had had a change of attitude, achieving good grades and even aspiring to the priesthood. He was toying with the notion of studying medicine at Ripon College in the early 1920s when he stumbled on his true calling. At Ripon, Tracy was active in various school organisations and served as president of his hall. Moreover, he was voted cleverest and most talented, and tied with a peer for most popular. Given a role in a melodrama called The Truth, he revealed a remarkable stage charisma and innate acting instinct. "Acting to me is always reacting," Tracy liked to say, and his famous stillness and intensity got him noticed first on Broadway, then in Hollywood. Despite his rather heavy Irish features, he became a big star in the 1930s thanks to films like Boys Town and Captains Courageous. He organised an acting company with his friends called the Campus Players and went on tour. While touring with the debate team, Tracy auditioned for the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, where he was offered a scholarship after performing a scene from one of his previous roles. After a year, he graduated from the Academy and began his professional career. He struggled in stock companies until his career took a positive turn when he partnered with actress Selina Royle. In 1926 he was cast in the George M. Cohan play Yellow, and Cohan lauded Tracy's acting skills. Cohan wrote a part just for Tracy in his hit play The Baby Cyclone. He'd met Louise Treadwell while working for a travelling theatre company in the early 1920s. The pair married and had 2 children, but when his son John turned out to be almost totally deaf, Tracy was consumed by Catholic guilt and decided the affliction was his fault. When the stock market crashed, he considered abandoning the theatre for a more stable life in Milwaukee, since many plays were closing. However, he was offered a dramatic role in The Last Mile, which proved to be a hit. At the same time, actors from Broadway were being scouted for Vitaphone shorts. He was scouted by director John Ford, who saw The Last Mile. His financial woes led him to sign with Fox and move to California. At Fox, Tracy was typecast in comedies and appeared in mostly unpopular films. Though he received some attention for his role in The Power and the Glory, his next few films were unremarkable to critics. He began to struggle with alcoholism, and his contract with Fox was terminated by mutual consent. His 25 films for Fox mostly lost money at the box office. For Tracy had not been the ideal husband. A strong streak of alcoholism ran through his family on his father's side, and Tracy was a messy, violent drinker who'd sometimes binge for weeks on end. There were numerous lost weekends when he would eventually be found by the studio in a cheap hotel with bottles and girls. He also had an eye for his leading ladies, and is said to have had affairs with Loretta Young, Joan Crawford, Jean Tierney and Ingrid Bergman. It was Katharine Hepburn, however, who really stole his heart. The pair fell in love on the set of Woman of the Year, the first of 9 hit films they would make together. In that movie they played a married couple who battle for supremacy, and the storyline echoed their relationship off-screen. Tracy deserves to be remembered for himself as a master of acting technique whose essence Hepburn herself defined. He never got in his own way. I still do. John Ford, who directed Tracy's first feature film, Up the River, and one of his last, The Last Hurrah, agreed. When I say Spencer Tracy is the best actor we ever had, I'm giving you something of my philosophy of acting. The best is most natural. Scenery never gets chewed in my pictures. I prefer actors who can just be. Tracy's ability to just be is apparent when you think of such contemporaries of his as Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, Gary Cooper, Cary Grant, James Stewart, and James Cagney. All of them are defined to some extent by mannerisms that lend themselves to caricature. But who has ever caricatured or imitated Spencer Tracy? Only Hepburn could upstage him, and Curtis tries hard to keep her from doing that. Louise Treadwell, who became Mrs. Spencer Tracy in 1923 and held on to that title that she prized for the next 44 years, even though they began to lead separate lives off and on as early as 1933. He also had an advanced Irish Catholic sense of guilt, and one source of that guilt was the congenital deafness of his son John. Louise devoted her life, and much of Tracy's money, to the clinic that she founded to deal with childhood deafness. Tracy, however, had an emotionally distant relationship with John, and writer Joseph L. Mankiewicz believed that he blamed himself in some way for his son's deafness. He didn't leave Louise, Mankiewicz said. He left the scene of his guilt, but they never divorced, partly because of his Catholicism and partly because Hepburn wasn't interested in marrying him. The other dominant fact about Tracy's off-screen life was that he was, in the words of director Henry King, an ugly drunk. Actor David Wayne recalled the last time Tracy laid waste to the tap room of the Lambs Club in New York. The huge supply of liquor that was stacked behind the bar he swept off and hurled to the floor and about the room. It looked as if a hurricane had struck. But he alternated his binges with long periods of sobriety, going on the wagon for months, even years, before finally succumbing once again. After he met Hepburn, the sober periods increased in their length, but the binges never disappeared, partly because, as Curtis comments, Hepburn considered the abuse of alcohol a failure of the will and not a disease. She encouraged him to drink in moderation, always a risk when, as one acquaintance observed, all he needed was a desert with rum in it to set him off. She was a mother hen. It was like he was her child. Hepburn said, "I'm like a little fly that buzzes around him all the time, and every once in a while he gives me a good swat." If that suggests either masochism on Hepburn's part or a physically violent relationship, it hasn't gone unnoticed. There were rumours of Tracy's hitting Hepburn, some of them while he was drunk. Hepburn's niece, Catherine Houghton, who starred with them in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, dismisses these reports perhaps a bit too casually. If he gave her a good whack, it's my suspicion that she asked for it. She was not a frail person. In the family we were all witnesses from time to time to her being maddeningly self-righteous and bossy, no doubt with good intentions, but still way out of line. Ernest Hemingway dismissed the Tracy Hepburn films as those toad and grasshopper comedies, meaning it partly as a slur on Tracy, whom he disliked as a man who could not hold his liquor. But if Tracy is the solid down-to-earth toad and Hepburn the flighty, busy grasshopper, Curtis had done a good job of making us appreciate the virtues of the toad. Although Louis B. Mayer felt Spencer Tracy lacked box office fire, Irving Thalberg pushed for Tracy to come to MGM, feeling that he could make it at a studio top-heavy with female stars. Signing with MGM in 1935, Tracy was featured the next year in two successes, San Francisco and Libeled Lady, although more as a glorified supporting player to Clark Gable and William Powell than a force who could carry his own film. He more than proved his star power and earned industry respect with back-to-back Academy Award-winning performances. He continued at MGM until problems developed on the set of Tribute to a Bad Man, where his imperious and confusing behaviour caused the production to shut down. Director Robert Wise was forced to fire Tracy from the film, effectively ending his 20 years with the studio. In declining health, Tracy became reclusive, never venturing from his rented home, but he developed a friendship with director Stanley Kramer, who guided him through the final decade of his life in such crowning performances as the Clarence Darrow-inspired lawyer in Inherit the Wind, and the transcendental judge in Judgment at Nuremberg. Suffering from emphysema, Tracy made his last screen appearance opposite Hepburn in Kramer's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Struggling through the production, Tracy died 2 weeks after filming was completed. Tracy's presence was a strong, quiet, reliable one. He gave the American cinema some of its most enduring and undeterred portrayals of stolid honesty and thoughtful scrupulousness. The inner strength and self-assurance he projected are in stark contrast to the cinema's current stars. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the life and legacy of Spencer Tracy? He deserves to be remembered for himself as a master of acting technique.